Hey Optimancers, Chris here. For the past few months I've been poring over Tasha's Cauldron of everything. I've been going through spells, feats, optional class features, and subclasses. And today I'm into fighters. For fighters we have two new subclasses, the Psy Warrior and the Rune Knight. However, we also have a number of optional class features, including the new fighting styles, and a number of new maneuvers for Battle Masters. Today I'm going to be going over those optional class features, and we'll look at each of the subclasses in my next couple videos. Before we get started, I want to recognize some of my patrons. Some viewers of this channel have chosen to support my work through Patreon. If you would like to support this channel, links provided in the video description. Patrons enjoy rewards such as early releases of ad-free versions of these videos. As well, my Archmage patrons join me for a D&D session each month. Today, I would like to specifically recognize Eric Wasserman, James Sprague, James Thomas, John Matera, John Cripps, Jonathan Haynes, Joshua Samuel Lappel, and Kurt G. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's get started. One thing all fighters have in common is a fighting style that they gain at level 1. All the classes that receive a fighting style received new options in Tasha's, but none got as many new options as the fighter. Up to this point, the fighter had only 6 options, and not all of those options were good. I think if I was to rank them from worst to best, I'd have to start with Great Weapon Fighting, because that's kind of a uniquely poor option that tends to add around +1 damage per attack, which isn't much for a major class feature. Also, because we're generally talking about bigger weapon damage to begin with, the percentage increase is even poorer. The 2-weapon fighting style might be a decent option if 2-weapon fighting in general was better. As it is, generally if your campaign is going to level 5 or further, that's likely not the route you want to go with or without this fighting style. Protection is a very so-so option that allows you to use your reaction to impose disadvantage on an enemy attack against an ally. Mainly this is so-so as the circumstances to set it up aren't happening regularly in combat, and it's requiring a reaction on your part. Now, defense is a perfectly serviceable option, and it's decent on any character. Straight +1 armor class has value to pretty much any character, despite the bonus being relatively minor. This is pretty much a default option, if none of the other options are a great fit for your character. Dueling is a pretty good option if you're using a one-handed weapon, as the +2 damage boost is approximately twice the benefit that Great Weapon Fighting provides, never mind each point being a bigger percentage of your overall damage. Increasing a D8 +3 to a D8 +5 is going to be about a 26% increase in damage. Then we have Archery, which is the most effective fighting style in the player's handbook, providing a very significant +2 bonus to hit. This is often combined with a Sharpshooter feat, which partially offsets the -5 to hit when we're shooting for the +10 damage boost. So how do the new Tasha's fighting style options for fighters measure up? Let's go through them. The first fighting style is Blind Fighting. This fighting style gives you blind sight to a range of 10 feet. Blind Fighting is probably a somewhat misleading name, as the benefit here actually goes beyond just fighting. The most obvious benefit to your character is if you are blinded for some reason, you can continue to fight without a penalty. However, if you find yourself in magical darkness or a heavily obscured area like a fog cloud, often both you and your enemies are effectively blinded, which means that you would get advantage to hit and they would get disadvantage to hit you back if you have this feature, and that's a massive mechanical advantage. This is also going to be effective against invisible enemies, essentially nullifying their mechanical advantage if they're within the blindsight range. This will also prevent that invisible enemy from hiding from you if they're within your range. But we don't stop there, because of course our party, or even our character, could be the source of magical darkness or a fog cloud. Then we decide when this is going to come into play. I've seen parties go this route, ensuring everyone has either this fighting style or Devil's Sight, and then throwing darkness into every major fight, blinding enemies and gaining the mechanical advantages. I'll put a warning here though, that although this is very, very effective, This also ends up being a tactic you pretty much get tied to for the entire campaign, as the investments to set this up are pretty high. So if you're thinking that this is the route you would like to go, I would just make sure that the rest of the players and the DM are on board before going this way. Finally though, a 10-foot blind sight might be useful outside of combat as well. You can effectively see invisible things, and you see in total darkness, and that doesn't necessarily require that you be in combat. Also, if you're multi-class with a spellcasting class, a lot of spells require that you're able to see your target, and this can open up doors in that respect as well. The width of 10-foot range, you are going to need to be close. So overall, I would call this an excellent option. If you plan to use the combination with darkness or fog clouds, it's likely the most powerful option, period. If you don't, then it becomes circumstantial, but it's still very effective when those circumstances arrive, which would have me still rank this among the better options overall. Our next option is Interception. When a creature you can see hits a target within 5 feet of you with an attack, you can use your reaction to reduce the damage by 1d10 plus your proficiency bonus. This on the surface sounds very similar to the protection combat style, but this one is actually better in a few different ways. The first and most important way it's better is that this takes place after the attack hits. That means if the attack would miss, you get to save your reaction. Maybe you're going to use it for later, or an opportunity attack, or some other reaction option. So just consider, for example, you have an ally and they're being attacked by a bandit captain. That enemy attacks your ally 3 times. With protection, you would need to pick one of those attacks to impose disadvantage using a reaction. In this case, we can simply wait and see what happens. If all 3 attacks miss, we can save our reaction. But if one attack hits, we know which attack to use our reaction on to interfere with. The second way this is better is we don't need to be wearing a shield. The requirement is that we either be wearing a shield or holding a simpler martial weapon. As we're talking about a fighter, I think the odds are good that we're going to satisfy this condition. This can give a fighter that would normally have poor combat style options, like a fighter with a 2-handed weapon for example, another choice. The third way is that instead of imposing disadvantage, we're automatically reducing the damage. You can use protection, and it may help or it may do nothing at all, but in this case we're always providing a benefit. At low levels, this will often reduce the damage right to 0. In the case of our example, we are going to have a better than even chance of reducing the bandit captain's damage to 0. But even if we don't, that damage will be significantly reduced, no matter what we roll. That brings us to the one way this is worse than protection, and that's that this isn't going to scale quickly, or at least not nearly as quickly, that the damage that an enemy inflicts on a hit will increase. A 1d12 plus 2 damage reduction on an enemy's damage at level 1 is huge. A 1d10 plus 6 damage reduction on an enemy's damage at level 17 might not even be worth the reaction. Finally though, and this is important, the biggest restriction of protection is not alleviated here at all. They both have the same big restriction, that the target of the attack still needs to be within 5 feet of you, and that means that most of the time, allies that are subject to enemy attacks, odds are you're not going to be able to use this to help them. Still, at lower levels, I think this is a great deal better than protection, and a decent option, but each time your level goes up, the effectiveness of this fighting style goes down. If I was to rate it overall, I would say it ranks somewhere behind the defensive fighting style, but still ahead of protection. And that brings us to our next style, Superior Technique. This fighting style allows for a fighter to access a maneuver from the Battlemaster subclass. As it happens, we'll be going over some new maneuver options later in this video. Of course, to fuel Battlemaster maneuvers, you need a superiority die, so you get a d6. This is a lower die than a Battlemaster is going to have, and you're only getting 1. Though depending on the maneuver you're using, sometimes the die type isn't all that important. But one way or the other, you're getting 1 use of the maneuver per short rest. Options like Commander Strike could give a rogue a second sneak attack, or, if you are also a rogue, other maneuvers could provide the additional sneak attack to your character. But maneuvers can do a lot of other things as well, such as impose conditions, move allies or enemies, or disarm enemies, for example. The issue here is that 1 use per short rest is not very much, and that's a pretty big issue. Still, maneuvers are good enough that I would say that overall this is okay, probably hovering around the defensive combat style and effectiveness. The next fighting style is thrown weapon fighting. This will allow you to draw a thrown weapon as part of the attack you make with it, and you do +2 damage if you hit with the thrown weapon. So the biggest issue this fighting style solves is that as a fighter, we're going to have access to extra attacks, whether it's through our class features at levels 5, 11, and 20, or whether it's just through an action surge. And neither of these work well with thrown weapons normally, because you're limited to drawing a single weapon on your turn. The thrown weapon fighting style essentially solves this issue entirely, and the 20th level fighter using action surge could draw and throw 6 weapons on their turn. However, the +2 damage, like with the dueling feat, is pretty significant as well. If throwing weapons is going to be part of what you do, this is going to make you a whole lot better at it. If your character concept involves throwing weapons, then I'd say this combat style is a must. However, if you're just considering your options for a ranged character, I would remind you that archery is amazing and probably the better option in most cases. Still, I could see this fighting style on a strength-based two-handed weapon fighter, giving you a ranged option that isn't terrible, and adding some versatility on a character where getting into position can be an issue. I also like that this fighting style means that a thrown weapon fighting concept is now doable in a way that isn't terrible with some good choices, which is good for giving us some more character options. Something to think about though is that if you're throwing a lot of weapons and those weapons aren't all magical, you're going to eventually face issues with things like resistances and immunities. But overall, I still think this is a pretty decent option for a number of fighters, though generally melee fighters, and I'd place it behind dueling, which means that if you're using a one-handed weapon, I'd probably go with dueling instead. Our final fighting style is Unarmed Fighting. This allows you to make unarmed strikes that deal d8 plus your strength modifier or damage, assuming you aren't using a weapon or shield, or a d6 plus strength otherwise. Now generally speaking, a fighter holding a weapon is going to want to strike with that weapon, and if they don't have one, they maybe want to pick one up. The unarmed fighting style is not going to keep up with weapon damage, so this one, it's not really about making your character more powerful in combat, but providing you some extra options that might be fun. Knock enemies around the room in a tavern brawl, beat up the monk for fun, or if an enemy really pisses you off, drop your sword and clock them in the nose. And although those are some fun options, if we are going to talk about power here, I can't give this a good rating, and it's probably the least powerful fighting style period. But I will say, a low-level monk still probably wants this, which is sad, but so it is for monks. So those are all the new fighting styles, all available at level 1 for fighters, which brings us to level 4 in martial versatility, which is relevant to the same discussion. Every time our fighter reaches a level where they would get an ability score improvement, and remember, a fighter gets a lot more of those than other classes do, they can replace a fighting style with another fighting style, or if they are a battle master, or otherwise have access to battle master maneuvers, they can replace a maneuver. Where I think this could be important is, for one, if you take the Interception combat style. As I mentioned, this is a decent combat style at low levels, but it's going to become less relevant with each new level. A fighter might consider switching it out once they notice they aren't getting enough mileage from it anymore, which I would estimate is probably going to happen around level 6 or so. We might also find that we want to grab something like the blind fighting style later in the campaign, and then this grants that option as well. And that takes us from the features every fighter can select to the new maneuvers for battle masters or other characters with either the superior technique fighting style or the martial adept feat. Speaking of which, don't take the fighting initiate feat to grab superior technique, since the martial adept feat gives the same benefit except you get 2 maneuvers instead of 1. There are 7 new options here, giving over 20 options to battle masters and the like. Our first option is ambush, which allows you to add your superiority die to either a stealth roll or an initiative roll. The way I read this, the decision to do this can come after the initial roll is made. I think this could be effective, but I wouldn't just use it whenever. If a stealth roll is important, and you're likely just a bit shy of what you need, or you roll initiative and you lose an important initiative by just a point or two, then this could be pretty dramatic. Waiting for that moment to use it, when it will make a significant difference, is going to be key here. Otherwise, I would say this isn't very good. However, used carefully, it's one of those maneuvers that won't come up all the time, but when it does, it's going to be pretty significant. Overall, I would rate this better than average, though it's not one of the best maneuvers. The next maneuver is bait and switch. This allows you to switch places with another willing creature on your turn by spending your superiority die. The roll of the die is added to the armor class of either you or the other creature, your choice. I have to say, this is probably my favorite maneuver, period, not just among the new ones, but among the old ones as well. Firstly, the switching places may not sound amazing, but there are tactical applications for this where it's going to be a big deal. Maybe it's getting an ally out of the doorway when they're about to go down. Maybe it's about getting out of melee, or getting an ally out of melee, without taking the disengage action. It could be also used to get an ally out of the mouth of the T-Rex that has them grappled and restrained. Though it's not really clear if you would take their place in the jaws or not, I would think common sense would say not. On top of that though, we finally get an opportunity to just add our superiority die to our armor class for a round. I've been wishing for this since the beginning. I'll take an armor class boost for an entire round over a damage reduction on one attack using my reaction easy. The flexibility to add it to either my character or the one I switched out with again could be a big help. So overall, bait and switch is an awesome maneuver, probably my favorite one from any source, and likely my first recommendation for anyone choosing between maneuvers. That brings us to brace. This one is pretty similar to riposte, as it provides an opportunity to use a reaction to make an attack for which we add a die to the damage. The only real difference is the trigger. With riposte, we need an enemy to make a melee attack against us and miss. With brace, we need an enemy to move into our reach. At first reading, my assumption was that brace would be triggered more often. But the more I think about it, I'm not sure that's clear at all. Riposte could, for example, come up multiple times in a single melee against a single creature. And if I'm the tank of the party, then I'm probably moving up to enemies rather than waiting for them to choose to move into reach of me. Riposte, however, has often been a choice for rogues to get a second sneak attack in a round. And if you are playing a rogue multiclass, then I would say it's quite likely you aren't the party tank, in which case you might find brace more likely to come into play. Riposte, however, I would say works better with rogues too, at least if you have 5 levels of rogue, as it gives you a reaction for when the enemy misses, or a different reaction for when they hit, so it just plays more nicely with the existing rogue features. So overall, some time to consider, I'm inclined to say that I would rate riposte and brace similarly, and I would be inclined to grab them on similar builds, namely builds that are very hard hitting with a single attack. But overall, I still think I like riposte a bit better. The next option is commanding presence. This allows you to expend a superiority die on an intimidation, performance, or persuasion check. As with ambush, the way I read this, you can choose to expend the die after the roll is made. Frankly, if I am playing a fighter, I would imagine that important initiative checks are almost certain to be coming up more than social rolls. And I think this is actually true on most characters. I mean, considering charisma is the primary ability score of warlocks, bards, sorcerers, and paladins, I think there's a pretty good chance that you as the fighter won't be making these rolls most of the time anyways. So this one I wouldn't think is a good choice for most builds. If I'm accessing this as a social character in a campaign heavy in those kinds of roles, and that's what I'm looking to boost, then maybe, but for most characters I would give this a pass. The next option is Grappling Strike. This allows you to use a superiority die to grapple a creature you've hit with a weapon. Then you add your superiority die to the athletics check made to grapple. Now, grapple can be a pretty useful tool for a melee character, allowing not only the ability to prevent movement of an enemy, but also to potentially drag them around. The biggest requirement here is that you're going to need a free hand for the grapple. And that means if you're using a two-handed weapon, you aren't going to be able to use it after you grapple. And if you aren't using a two-handed weapon, then you could have just made the grapple check in place of the weapon attack, and you wouldn't have to hit first to trigger it, and you likely aren't going to be doing that much damage with that weapon if you hit anyway. The bonus die to the grapple checks is nice, so I could see considering this on a character that is focused on grappling. Keep in mind, though, that grappling also involves some size limitations, so this isn't always going to be helpful against some opponents, even in case where restricting movement would be helpful. Also keep in mind that a grappled creature might try to escape, or they may just attack you, and they can do that without penalty. So this isn't a maneuver I would grab for any character. If I was playing a grappling specialist, then I think this is okay. But it's not an essential maneuver, so overall I would rank this fairly low on the list. Though again, for the right kind of character, I think it's decent. Our next option is Quick Toss. This allows us to use our bonus action to make a ranged attack with a thrown weapon, and drawing that weapon is part of the attack. We add our superiority die to the damage roll if the attack hits. Like with the thrown weapon fighting style, this isn't for all characters. And if you want to be the best ranged character possible, you're still going to be going with archery and grab a bonus action attack without expending superiority dice through crossbow expert and a hand crossbow. However, again, if you want to make a thrown weapon specialist, I do think this is okay, but not nearly as necessary as the fighting style for thrown weapons. Regardless of the type of character that accesses this, you're going to have a very limited pool of superiority dice, and there is a good chance that you aren't going to get enough damage from this to make that expenditure all that great. So my overall opinion here is that at least power-wise, this one is still on the lower end. Finally, we finish up with another combat maneuver that adds to skill rolls. In this case, the skills we can add are Investigation, History, or Insight. Otherwise, this works like Commanding Presence or Ambush. Of the three, I would consider this the least likely to be of value to you. In my experience, the super important checks are less likely to be any of these than the others that the Commanding Presence and Ambush maneuvers cover. Also, we're talking about skills based off intelligence and wisdom, which, as a fighter, are very likely not our strong suits to begin with. Why would you have the fighter make the important investigation check in the first place? This, again, is near the low end for the vast majority of fighter builds. So to recap, when it comes to the fighting styles, I think blind fighting is our best new option, though still not as good as archery if you're choosing between the two. There are a lot of medium level options otherwise, though unarmed fighting is likely going to be the least effective overall. When it comes to the new maneuvers, we see a bigger spread. Bait and switch is the big winner here in my opinion. Both ambush and brace I could see being reasonable choices depending on the build. The others I'd probably not consider for the average fighter, though they may be decent options for specialized builds. And that's all the new options for fighters. As a DM, I don't see why you wouldn't allow all these, though again, if there's a discussion about fog clouds or darkness as a regular tactic in combat, I think that's a decision you want to make as a group, and only do it if everyone's on board. What are your opinions of these new options? Have you had a lot of success with any of them yet? Let me know in the comments below. In my next video, I'm going to be discussing the Psy Warrior, and then I'm going to cover the Rune Knight in the video following. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.